They didn't even step out of the car. My mom just rolled down the window, handed me $60 and said, "Good luck out there." Then they drove off like I was luggage they'd finally returned. My name is Clara Voss. I'm 19, and that was the moment I learned that sometimes freedom doesn't look like open skies. It looks like being left behind. I stood there on the side of the road, still in my polyester graduation gown, holding a half-deflated balloon that kept bumping my shoulder like it was in on the joke. Behind me, the school was locking its doors. Ahead of me, there was nothing. No home, no plan, no one waiting. Just a bus stop, shimmering in the summer heat. If you're listening to this, take a second and tell me where you're watching from. Maybe you've had a moment like that, when life cuts you loose before you're ready. Sometimes, sharing where we've been is how we remind each other that the road doesn't end here. The truth is, I wasn't angry that day. I was empty. Like someone had turned down the volume on the world. The sun kept burning, the cars kept passing, and I kept standing. A girl with nowhere to go and everything to prove. My parents thought they were teaching me a lesson about independence. What they really taught me was what it feels like when justice leaves the room. That afternoon, I bought a one-way ticket to a town I'd never heard of. The ticket clerk didn't even look up when I said, "Anywhere that isn't here." I had $38 left after bus fare and a notebook in my bag. I didn't know it yet, but that notebook would become my compass. The first chapter in learning that justice sometimes begins quietly, with a single decision, to keep going anyway. If this story finds you tonight, subscribe and tell me below. What did freedom look like when it first found you? The bus hissed to a stop like it was sighing for both of us. I climbed aboard with a backpack that smelled faintly of detergent and disappointment. No one looked up. Maybe that was a gift. To start a new life surrounded by strangers who didn't care what I'd lost. The ride was long, the air conditioning broken, and the windows fogged with heat. I watched the world slide by in fragments. Cornfields, gas stations, the backs of old billboards promising things they'd stopped delivering years ago. When the driver called out Brookfield, the name sounded like it had potential. But when I stepped off, it felt more like a memory trying to forget itself. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your own heartbeat sound impolite. A diner, a hardware store, 2 gas stations pretending to be different businesses. That was the whole map. I found a motel called Sunny Pines, which was funny because there were no pines, and the sun looked like it had given up. The woman at the front desk slid me a key without asking for ID. "How long you staying?" she muttered. I looked at the 20 in my hand and said, "Until this runs out." The room smelled like old carpet and broken trust, but the door locked and the shower worked. By new standards, that was enough. That first night, I couldn't sleep. Every time a truck passed outside, the walls shook like they were remembering something too. I sat at the small desk and opened my notebook, the one thing I hadn't thrown away. On the first page, I wrote in block letters, "Clara's Survival Guide." Beneath it, I listed what I could do. Make scrambled eggs, change a tire, clean anything if it paid. It wasn't much, but it was more than nothing. In the morning, I walked to the nearest gas station and asked if they needed help. The manager, a man with hands stained by years of fuel and habit, looked at me for a long time. "You can mop?" he asked. "Yes, sir." He handed me a broom like it was a peace treaty. $8.50 an hour, under the table. That was the first job I ever got on my own name, not my parents'. At night, I mopped floors at the Chinese buffet down the road. The work left my muscles aching and my hands raw, but I liked the sound of it and the rhythm of cleaning, the quiet justice in making something dirty look whole again. Maybe that's how healing begins, not with a grand speech, but with the sound of a mop sliding across tile under fluorescent light. I didn't know it yet, but those small acts, sweeping, scrubbing, showing up, were rebuilding me, piece by piece, like wood being sanded back to its grain. Days blurred into a pattern, mornings at the gas station, evenings at the buffet, nights with the hum of the motel fridge as my only company. It wasn't the life anyone would envy, but it was the first one I was fully responsible for. Every dollar I earned smelled faintly of gasoline and soap, and somehow that scent began to feel like progress. One evening, as I walked back under a sky the color of rust, I passed a diner called Rita's. Through the window, I saw a woman wiping tables, her purple hair tied up in a messy knot, a cigarette tucked behind her ear like punctuation. Something about her looked solid, like she belonged in her own story. The next morning, I went in and asked if they needed help. The manager barely glanced up from the register. "You can wash dishes?" I nodded. "Start tonight." That's how I met Joelle. Or Jo, as she insisted everyone call her. She was older, maybe late 20s, sharp-tongued but kind in the places that mattered. On my second shift, she found me eating crackers behind the kitchen door and said, "You look like someone trying to pass for okay." I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled. She tossed me half her sandwich and said, "Don't get used to generosity. This town runs on caffeine and sarcasm." Jo became the kind of friend I didn't know I was missing. After closing, we'd sit outside by the dumpsters, trading stories that weren't really stories, just confessions said softly enough to pass for jokes. She introduced me to Bruno, her three-legged dog, and to Caleb, who ran a second-hand furniture shop that smelled like lemon oil and old music. "He's weird," Jo warned, but weird in the useful way. Caleb needed someone to help sand and refinish wood in the back room. It paid almost nothing, but he offered free coffee and a place to breathe. I said yes before thinking. The first day, he showed me how to follow the grain of the wood, how to listen for where it still wanted to live. "You've got patience," he said quietly, and for some reason that sentence cracked something open inside me. No one had ever said that without a but attached. After work, I'd walk back to the motel covered in sawdust, tired but lighter somehow. My palms were calloused, my arms sore, but my heart, it was starting to remember how to trust steady things again. That tiny shop, those small jobs, those people who asked nothing more than honesty, they didn't just give me work. They gave me proof that good people still existed and that maybe healing wasn't a miracle at all. Maybe it was just what happens when you let kindness do its quiet work. Caleb's shop became my second home. It wasn't much, just a room lined with mismatched shelves and the smell of varnish, but it held a kind of quiet that felt like permission. He taught me how to sand corners smooth, how to see the shape waiting beneath the splinters. "Wood remembers," he said once, running a hand over a dented tabletop. "You just have to show it what it can be again." I didn't realize he was also talking about me. In the evenings, I started sketching. At first, it was nothing more than doodles on the backs of receipts, ideas for shelves, tables, small boxes with secret compartments. Jo would glance at them between drags of her cigarette. "You could sell these," she said one night. I laughed it off. "They're just drawings." But 2 weeks later, she sent a photo of one to her cousin Lena, who managed a small home boutique in a nearby town. Lena's reply came fast. "Can she build it?" I wanted to say no. I didn't have a workshop, barely had tools, and my bank account looked like a bad joke. But Jo's voice echoed in my head. "Don't be dumb. Say yes and figure it out after." So I said yes. For 4 nights straight, I stayed in Caleb's back room, coaxing a shelf out of reclaimed pine and borrowed tools. My hands ached, my nails cracked, and when it was finally done, it leaned slightly to the left, but it was mine. When I delivered it, Lena paid me $150 and asked for 4 more by the end of the month. I walked outside with the cash in my pocket and the sun on my face, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was surviving. I felt like I was becoming. That night, I opened my notebook and crossed out Clara's survival guide. Beneath it, I wrote a new title, Building Better. Because maybe healing isn't about forgetting where you've been. It's about making something strong from the pieces that didn't break. And as I looked at my hands, still dusted with sawdust and hope, I understood. I wasn't just fixing wood anymore. I was restoring myself. The weeks that followed felt different, like someone had quietly tilted my world toward the light. The orders from Lena kept coming, small but steady. Each new piece I built carried more of me in it, a little less fear, a little more purpose. Caleb let me use his back room whenever he could spare the space. Sometimes he'd wander in, coffee in hand, watching me work. "You don't rush the grain," he said once. "That's rare." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. Compliments still felt like language I hadn't learned, but his words stayed with me, like a promise that patience itself could be a kind of justice. Every dollar I earned went into an envelope I labeled "Break the Cycle." It wasn't much, just wrinkled bills and coins that clinked like hope, but it gave shape to my intention. I wasn't saving for a car or a bigger room, I was saving for distance. Enough space between who I'd been and who I was becoming that no one could confuse the two. Joe called it my justice fund. Every night after our shifts, we'd sit on the diner steps sharing cheap coffee. She'd tease, "You're building an empire one splinter at a time." I'd laugh, but deep down I believed her, because for the first time, I was building something that couldn't be taken back, a life built on effort, not approval. Then one afternoon, a woman walked into the shop asking for a custom piece. She'd seen one of my shelves in Lena's boutique and wanted a small bench that feels like it remembers where it came from. Her words hit something deep. That night as I worked, I realized that maybe that was my craft's purpose, not just to make furniture, but to give broken things another chance to belong. When I delivered the bench, she paid me in cash and said quietly, "It's honest work. You can feel it." I smiled all the way back to the motel. For years I'd been trying to earn love. Now I was earning respect, and it felt cleaner, truer. Each finished piece became a small verdict in my favor. Proof that justice can be gentle, that healing doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply hums through the sound of sandpaper, through hands that refuse to stop believing in what can still be made whole. Work started to multiply in quiet ways. First one order, then 3, then a weekend project that turned into a steady rhythm of creation. The smell of wood and varnish became the scent of my new life. I moved from the motel to a small room above the tire shop, where the ceiling leaked when it rained, but the rent was cheap and the noise was honest. Each morning, I woke up before dawn, brewed instant coffee, and opened the notebook that had once been my survival guide. Now it was a ledger of progress, sketches, costs, and small victories written in pencil. Caleb began introducing me to local vendors. "This is Clara," he'd say with quiet pride. "She sees what wood wants." It sounded poetic, almost mystical, but really, it was just patience. Learning to listen to materials the way I wished someone had once listened to me. The town started to remember my name, not because of who I'd been, but because of what I could build. Then came Marcus, a filmmaker who visited Caleb's shop looking for a coffee table. He noticed the unfinished pieces stacked in the corner and asked, "Who made those?" When Caleb pointed to me, Marcus smiled in that rare, gentle way that doesn't carry pity. "You design like a storyteller," he said, studying my sketches. "Each piece has a reason to exist." I didn't know how to respond. Compliments still made me nervous, but there was something different about his tone. He wasn't talking about talent, he was recognizing purpose. Marcus asked if he could feature my work in a short video series he was making about local creators. I hesitated. Attention had always felt dangerous, like a door that could swing shut at any moment. But he said something that stayed with me. "Sometimes sharing your work isn't about being seen, it's about being understood." So I agreed. He filmed the way I sanded, how I traced my fingers along the grain, how I whispered to the wood as if it were alive. The video was called Hands Make Homes. It wasn't glamorous, just real. The sounds of scraping, sanding, soft music in the background. When he uploaded it, something unexpected happened. People reached out, strangers, asking if I took orders, if I shipped, if I could teach. For the first time, I realized that my story wasn't just mine anymore. It had turned into something larger, a message about rebuilding, about quiet justice found through honest work. The same hands that had once trembled from fear were now shaping warmth for others. Each night after closing the shop, I'd sweep the floor and think about how far I'd come from that bus stop. Not through revenge, not through miracles, but through labor, grace, and the decision to keep showing up, even when no one was watching. The messages that followed the video's release felt unreal. Orders came in faster than I could sand a single board. People from towns I'd never heard of wanted shelves, tables, benches, pieces made by the girl from Hands Make Homes. I didn't think of myself that way, but the name stuck. What surprised me wasn't the attention, it was the tone of their messages. They didn't just want furniture, they wanted meaning, something honest, something built by hands that understood imperfection. Marcus stopped by the shop one afternoon with 2 coffees and a look of quiet pride. "You realize what you're doing, right?" he asked. I shrugged. "Building furniture?" He smiled. "Building people's faith in what lasts." The words hit me harder than I expected. For so long, I'd equated survival with hiding. But now, every piece I sent out into the world carried my name like a small act of justice, proof that even those written off could create beauty that endured. Life began to settle into something close to peace. Caleb refused to charge me rent for the shop corner anymore. "You keep the lights on," he said. Joe brought Bruno by every Friday, pretending it was for the dog's emotional wellness, though I knew she just wanted to check that I was eating. Evenings smelled like coffee, lemon oil, and sawdust, scents that once meant labor now meant belonging. But the real change happened inside me. I stopped counting the days since my parents left, stopped measuring my worth against their absence. The ache was still there, yes, but softer, like a scar that no longer stung when touched. Forgiveness wasn't dramatic. It was choosing to keep building even when no one apologized. One morning, while organizing orders, I found a half-withered graduation balloon tangled in my toolbox, the same one that had followed me at that bus stop years ago. I almost threw it away, then hesitated. Instead, I tied it above my desk. A reminder. Not of rejection, but of the day I began rewriting my own verdict. As sunlight filtered through the workshop window, I realized something simple yet profound. Justice doesn't always come with punishment. Sometimes it comes with peace. When you create something honest enough to heal what once was broken. Weeks passed, and the calm that once felt temporary began to feel like home. My days found a rhythm, the scrape of sandpaper, the hum of Caleb's radio, the steady thump of Bruno's tail against the shop floor. It was an orchestra of ordinary sounds, each one proof that life could be gentle again. Then, one afternoon while I was varnishing a tabletop, my phone buzzed with a message that froze my hands mid-air. "Hey, stranger. Just thinking about you. Hope you're well." It was from my mother. I stared at the screen for a long time, the name glowing like a ghost I'd already buried. For years, I had imagined that moment, what I'd say, how it would feel. But when it finally arrived, I felt nothing but stillness. Not anger, not joy, just distance. More messages followed. "Your cousin saw your work online. We're all so proud of you." Then another from my father this time. "There's a family reunion coming up. It's been too long. Would love to see you there." Attached was a flyer full of smiling cartoon faces holding hands, the kind of image that made pain look polite. I printed it and pinned it to the shop fridge, not as an invitation, but as a reminder. The paper fluttered whenever someone opened the door, a silent test of how much power the past still had over me. Joe noticed it first. "You thinking of going?" she asked, sipping her coffee. I shrugged. "Haven't decided." She grinned. "Then decide to walk in like you own the place." For nights, I kept turning it over in my mind. That park, those faces, the people who had watched me leave without a word. Part of me wanted to stay far away. Another part wanted to stand there again, not as the girl they dismissed, but as the woman I had built from her ashes. The flyer stayed on the fridge, curling at the edges, waiting. And though I told myself I hadn't chosen yet, deep down I knew I would go. Not for them, but for the version of me that had once waited by a bus stop, believing no one would ever turn back. This time, I would be the one arriving. The morning of the reunion arrived with the kind of sunlight that made everything look too honest. I stood in front of the mirror in my workshop, smoothing the wrinkles out of my white linen shirt, my reflection framed by sawdust and sketches. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from memory. I thought of Joe's words, "Walk in like you own the place." Maybe I didn't own the place, but I owned myself, and that was enough. When the black car pulled up, its engine low and steady, it felt like a heartbeat I finally controlled. The park was already crowded when I arrived. Picnic tables, laughter, music from a portable speaker. Heads turned, conversations faltered. My mother froze mid-sentence, my father's plastic cup tilting in his hand. For a moment, no one knew what to do. Then I smiled, slow and steady. "Hey, everyone." It wasn't a grand entrance, it was a reclamation. I walked across the grass, every step erasing the image of the girl they'd left on the curb years ago. My mother reached me first, clutching a napkin like it could shield her. "You look wonderful," she said. "Nice spread," I replied gently, nodding toward the food table. My father's eyes flickered, guilt, pride, confusion, all fighting for space. "Didn't expect you," he managed. "Neither did I said. "But I'm here." The relatives circled like moths around a flame they didn't understand. Compliments poured out, soft and rehearsed. "We always knew you'd do well. You must be so grateful for the lessons we taught you." I just smiled, letting the silence speak for me. Every word they said rewrote their version of the past, but I didn't correct them. True justice doesn't require an argument. It requires presence. As the sun dipped lower, I caught my reflection in the drink table's glass container. Calm, grounded, untouchable. The same people who once turned away now watched, searching for a weakness that no longer existed. I felt no anger, no need to prove, just peace. When I finally turned to leave, I saw my parents standing side by side, smaller somehow, framed by the fading light. They didn't call after me. They didn't have to. I had already taken back what they'd once refused to give, my own dignity. The car door closed with a soft click, and the sound felt like punctuation, the end of a sentence I'd been rewriting for years. As the park disappeared in the rear window, I didn't feel triumph or revenge. I felt clean, lighter, like justice had finally finished whispering my name. Back at the shop, the air smelled of cedar and coffee, my two favorite proofs of life. Jo was waiting, Bruno snoring at her feet. "So," she said, half grinning, "did they cry or combust?" I laughed. "Neither." They just stood there, like they'd seen a stranger who looked like regret. Jo nodded. "Good. You didn't go there to make peace with them. You went there to make peace with yourself." That night, after everyone left, I stayed behind. The shop was quiet except for the hum of the old fridge. I pulled out my first notebook, the one that began with Clara's survival guide, and turned to the last page. The words, "Break the cycle," were still there, faded but fierce. Underneath, I wrote one more line. Done. I realized then that real justice doesn't always happen in courtrooms or confrontations. Sometimes it happens in silence, in the choice to keep building when others stop believing. It's found in the patience to heal, in the dignity of not needing applause, and in the grace of forgiving without forgetting. As the night air drifted through the open door, I looked around the shop, the tables, the shelves, the light spilling across the floor. And I smiled. Everything here had been broken once, and yet everything stood. If this story has reached you, maybe it's because some part of you is still sanding down old wounds, still trying to make them smooth again. Don't stop. Keep building. Keep believing. And when you're ready, write your own ending. If this story moved you, like this video and subscribe for more family stories about quiet strength, justice, and healing. And tell me below, what does breaking the cycle mean to you?